My guest today is Michael Coren, an old friend and a co-religionist who's written a book on the Roman Catholic Church called The Future of Catholicism. Very interesting book. It's not, I guess, everyone's taste, because not everyone is interested in the subject, but for anybody who is, it's a very provocative and, as always, well-written book, and I do urge you to buy it and read it. Very suitable Christmas gift, if I may say so, without becoming too avuncular to our viewers. Michael, you have been intermittently, but for a very long time, a commentator on Catholic affairs. Mm-hmm. This book, if I may characterize it, is, and tell me, obviously you will, if I haven't got this right, but it is advising people that the Church is going to entrench in views that it holds that are, broadly speaking, controversial, and that it is, in effect, at least its leadership is resigned to losing some ostensible adherents, but in effect, this is, I guess, your judgment, compensate for that by an increased rigor of the faith of those who are continuing practitioners. Now, is that fair, or am I
I think to a large extent, yes. I mean, we tend to think of the Church under this Pope, Pope Francis, but we've got to remember that just as presidents and prime ministers and parties and policies come and go, so do popes. The Church remains the Church. Mm. And on the moral teachings,
it has been there longer than any state.
It really has. And on the moral issues, it's not going to change. Nothing will change on those teachings, which are often, by their nature, the most controversial. The way they're conveyed to people, the way the message is delivered to people, I think will change. We've seen in Pope Francis quite a radical departure. But if people want transformation of teaching, I'm afraid they're going to have to find a different church.
Now, I think it is possible to conclude that the College of Cardinals cast about for the most bulletproof, squeaky clean, untarnishable upholder of traditional church views, and settled upon the current Pope, who, of course, I understand ran second in the previous conclave against Pope Benedict. But they can't try as they might, the enemies of the Church, who are, of course, numerous, vocal, insidious, and their ant-like movements are always with us. They can't find anything linking this Pope at all to any misjudgment in the whole adolescent molestation question. Mm-hmm. They can't, although they tried, it failed completely, link him to improper relationships with the former military junta in Argentina. They can't find anything against him. He used to ride a bicycle. He didn't live in the Archbishop's palace, which is right beside the Casa Rosada in Buenos Aires, just beside where the president lives, where Perón and Evita spoke from the balcony. He's an absolutely unassailable person in his character, and conceded by all to be a generous and unpretentious personality, and of course a man of very high culture. But he was installed to defend those battlements, and he's going to defend them. Now, do you attach any credence to that view? They just took the strongest candidate to hold the standard?
There were certain qualifications. They were looking for someone, I believe, who he had non-European. And I suppose Latin American is the next.
But Italian parents, so it was close enough.
That's a very, very important point, because with Italian parents, Italian father certainly, he understood how the Italian mind works. And with all due respect to its greatness, how sometimes it can be rather Machiavellian, particularly in Vatican politics. But he was an outsider sufficiently, being from Argentina, from Latin America, that he could close a few doors, fire a few people, and get away with it.
And he can speak the lingo to the Romans.
Absolutely fluent, yeah. And but both in the language and in the style of the language, because if friendships are built up over a long period of time, it's very difficult to say to that person, you're gone, you're out of it. He did that very quickly. He got rid of various people. Mm-hmm. He changed a certain style. I have a great admiration for Benedict. I think Pope Benedict was a wonderful man.
Towering intellect.
Towering intellect. And he also affirmed the orthodoxy of liturgy and practice and worship.
Liturgically, I mean, I'm getting close to far beyond my capabilities here, but he was the finest pope in my time. He
Without doubt.
constructed magnificent services, I thought.
Without doubt. And for example, Anglican converts to the church in the Ordinariate in Britain and in Canada and in the United States were enabled by him. Pope John Paul was an extraordinary man, but there were certain things he didn't do particularly well. I mean, you mentioned the abuse crisis in passing earlier.
No, he let it go a long way.
He did, because to him, I believe, a priest was the man who stood up against the commissar and the stormtrooper.
Yeah.
And the idea, it was beyond his comprehension, there could be abuse of young people.
Yeah.
I don't think he fully understood. Benedict did. One of the tragedies of Benedict is he was
It's the
accused.
difference between a Pole and a German, too.
Yes, and a worldliness perhaps, but he certainly, he took no prisoners when it came to the abuse crisis. Now, Pope Francis has followed Pope Benedict. He set up a new commission. He's aware of this. There's a worldliness about him. I mean, I thought it was quite beautiful, actually, when he, and it seems a small thing, but he was coming back from Brazil, and he used the word gay for the first time. Now, I know these are semantics, and the word homosexual is not pejorative, but it is cold, it's clinical. And gay people would prefer to be called gay people.
Yes.
Well, there will be some clashes between...
He was speaking English, was he? Or
No,
is gay
I
in
think
other
he was
languages
speaking Italian. Or Spanish, I think it was Italian. But whilst there will be disagreements between the aspirations of the gay community and the teachings of the Catholic Church, we have to, whenever possible, come together in some sort of friendship. And what he was saying was, this is a term we must use. This is a term which is required. It is a kinder, gentler term. And he used it. Now, some people on the hard right said, how could he use such... How could he not use such a word?
Those of us who are semanticists somewhat object to the, broadly speaking, gay community just co-opting that word, though.
It took a long time.
Yeah.
And they did, and of course now...
But it has another meaning, the
Well, it
traditional
does.
meaning, that's quite useful sometimes.
Yes, it does. And of course, they've now reintroduced the word queer, the generic term to describe
Yes.
gay, lesbian, and so on. But I don't think losing... The great play, A Man for All Seasons, I mean, I don't know if you... In the original, and also in the movie, too, there's a line where Maul's daughter says to her... says to him, you look very gay. Now, that can't be used today, obviously, in a modern version of the play, because people cringe and they laugh and they smirk. But the point is here, the Pope was saying, while I will not compromise an inch on the teachings of the Church, I will compromise wherever I can in trying to make people feel welcome and warm and invited into Catholicism.
And then there was the famous interview with Civiltà Cattolica, where he excited the uncomprehending left to think and get to the edges of their chairs that he was about to abandon the entire doctrine of the Catholic Church and turn it into essentially a poll-taking and following organization. When what he really said, as I read it, was that we must not allow our critics to be justified in accusing us of being overly preoccupied with these matters. People who habitually transgress the Church's counsel of perfection of human conduct are no less souls than those who do so less frequently. And people who happen to be gays or engage in various other activities that are not optimal from a moral standpoint or a theological one are still human souls, and we're interested in everybody.
It's always been the teaching of the Church.
Of course, but it was in the popular imagination underemphasized in a way that enabled the critics of the Church to accuse it, in effect, of being a bunch of septuagenarian celibates telling everybody a lot of humbug about their sex life.
It's true, but as early as the 1970s, the Vatican was saying that what we'd call homophobia today, anti-gay attitudes were unchristian and unacceptable. But that conversation couldn't take place under Benedict. It wasn't Benedict's fault, but he was already pigeonholed as being this Germanic Rottweiler type, intolerant.
Ex-Nazi.
Yeah, a horrible thing to say.
That's monstrous libel.
But Pope Francis started with a different narrative, a different conversation, and he is being listened to. Now, the interview you mentioned, one wonders if it was completely accurate, and now we've been told that notes weren't taken. Did he really say these things? But when he said obsess about abortion and same-sex marriage, he wasn't condemning those who are active on the issue, and in fact he's reinforced church teaching. How can he not on these issues? I think what he was saying was, if we only discuss those, if we only talk about same-sex marriage and abortion, then nobody will listen to us at all. Better to speak about many things and within that conversation be heard than be silenced and told you have no place in the public square.
Now, I think he said both, at least that's how I read the interview. But to me, in a way, the most interesting thing in that interview was his extraordinary knowledge of classical music to the point of recollecting specific performances of orchestras of certain operas and symphonies on exact dates.
Incredibly cultured man, incredibly literate man, and combining that with a genuine charisma. You'll know exactly what I mean. There are wonderful clergy, wonderful men, but they almost overcompensate because they don't have children. So when children run into the room, they're so eager to be loving and kind. And when we have children...
It's like grandparents.
Well, exactly.
Your grandparents are kinder to you than
yeah, because they can leave after a couple of hours.
Yeah.
But there's a reality. Now, there was a beautiful scene, a wonderful image when that little boy, I think from Colombia, was on stage when the Pope was meeting various people. And his reaction to the little orphan boy was splendid, because it wasn't, "Oh, you're so marvelous. Please, my son, come here." It was a pat on the head, "But I'm also busy." It was affection. "Look at the cross, isn't that beautiful? But also, I'm busy." There was something so balanced about it. And I think we've got the balance right in this man. The church has been reintroduced to people.
What I found really very moving was his reception of that terribly disfigured man.
Well, there were two occasions, actually. One with a man who had so much coverage with these growths and so on. Another man most of his face had disappeared through what he'd had to go through. And again, I know cynics will say, "Well, it's just a photo op." It wasn't a photo op.
No.
He was surprised, certainly on one occasion, and his reaction was one of such honesty and such integrity in the time he spent with that person. And there's a greatness here. There is a greatness.
It was like what we read about some of the missionaries dealing with
leprosy.
I was a vice president of Cardinal Lege's charity, and he built a hospital in the Cameroons, and we dealt with some very severe cases there at times. I don't mean that I did anything heroic, but the Cardinal did. Michael, let me just explore some of these points. May I just quote you just one line from your book?
I love to be quoted, Conrad.
We have at the end of the chapter on female ordination and married priests, a future church refusing to waste time with the colossal and narcissistic digression of the fantasy of female ordination. A narcissistic digression, a colossal and narcissistic digression. Aren't you being a little severe? I mean, it's a perfectly legitimate question to raise.
No, I don't think it is. Now, when it comes to a married clergy, that's totally different. The church kind of...
but that's not what I was saying.
But, no, it's a digression. Every woman I have met who is a faithful Catholic, including my wife, but I'm speaking of huge numbers of people over the years, they have no interest in female ordination. They care about the church, they love the church, they're strong, independent women who believe in gender equality, but they don't want to be ordained because they know it cannot be. It contravenes the teaching of Scripture. The women I've met who make a lot of noise about female ordination, and there aren't many of them, frankly, tend to be people who dislike the church entirely.
No, they're seizing a pretext to attack it, I agree.
Exactly.
But that, again, the illegitimacy of much of the criticism does not address the substantive point.
The point is that the church has always been, Christianity has always been embracing of female equality. One of the reasons why so many slaves and women became Christians in the 1st and 2nd century, because Christianity and the church taught
Mariology and the elevation of female saints,
exactly,
as you point out, exalts women. The idea that the church is misogynistic
is
ridiculous.
And when Jesus, after the resurrection, the first people that Jesus showed himself to, and I think it's a very important point, women.
Yes.
Now, a woman's testimony in a court in 1st century Jewish life was worth half that of a man. So he was making a point here. I will show myself to you first. We know that Jesus gave women positions of authority. So he did understand he was a revolutionary, but at the same time, he never ordained a woman.
But if I may, and I agree with everything you've just said, and I thought you made these points very well in your book, but as I understand it, the whole argument against women priests essentially consists of the fact that Jesus did not have female disciples. And I would go further. I agree with you, which I take to be the implication, or one of the implications of what you say, that we can, and I think to a degree the church is doing it, build women up to a role at least equivalent to men in other ways than making them priests. I agree with that, and I agree it's happening. But the fact that Jesus Christ did not name female disciples does not in itself mean that there's anything wrong with having female priests.
Well, there's more to it than that. There is also that the prime purpose and vocation of a priest is to represent Jesus at the Mass, at the Eucharist. This is my body, this is my blood. There is also the fatherhood of God. I think Scripture is a complete story of what gender means, and gender is incredibly important. And as I said earlier, equality is always implicit in church teaching. But equality doesn't mean doing the same things. There are various roles that I could never fulfill in the Catholic Church. I'm simply not qualified. And I don't
think we'd make very good nuns, Michael.
I'd make a bloody awful priest as well, Conrad. I'd be terrible. But why I think it's such a digression is that what the church has to achieve in the coming years, it has to reach out to the genuinely poor in the third world. It has to reach out to people who are struggling with marriage, who are struggling with their sexuality. It has to reach out to people who feel the church has nothing left to say to them. Female ordination is very much a bourgeois conceit. If we, the third world, Africa and Asia, where the seminaries are bursting at the seams of the numbers of people, where they can't build churches quickly enough, none of these people are saying, what about female ordination? It's women in North America and Western Europe who, with all due respect, have quite a lot of time on their hands. They're the ones who obsess about the issue.
And they're not sensitive to the traditions involved here, the intellectual traditions as well as the customary ones.
They're often ignorant of them and hostile towards them.
In many cases that would be true. In fairness, I'm sure some of them are not, but many of them are. And many of them are just using this as a pretext to assault an organization they are opposed to anyway. But undermining, or at least questioning, the rigor and even the motives of the critics of the institution does not in itself address the issue.
No, it doesn't.
Leaving out the nature and motivations of those who agitate for female ordination, what's wrong with it?
Well, I think I've outlined that. It would contradict the teachings of Jesus in Scripture.
Well, his practice, but he didn't ever say that I know of, we're simply not having women priests.
Well, nor did he say that we shouldn't commit incestuous relationships. It didn't mean that he supported them. I mean, the lack of a negative doesn't mean a positive.
But he told Peter to found a church, but he left him a fair bit of liberality how to do it.
Well, when he was at Caesarea Philippi, Banyas today in northern Israel, when he said in front of that huge great rock, that wall, which was a place of pagan sacrifice, and I wish people would realize the visual aspect of this. This enormous great rock wall where it was the center of pagan worship, way out of Jewish territory, quite dangerous to be. 3 days, a 4-day walk from Judea and Galilee, and then says to Peter, now you are the rock in front of this great rock. You are now in charge, Peter. And even though Paul would argue with Peter, he would always want Peter to give the final authority. The ordination of women, it hasn't been an issue until very recent times, and it's no coincidence, but with the advance of secular feminism, we have some women, and a very small number, who say, it's not that we want to be ordained, we want you to talk about female ordination. Pope John Paul said, no, it's over. Pope Benedict said the same thing. Pope Francis, the great hope of the left, and I think that's a misreading, of course, has said, no, that is not a conversation
He was only their great hope because they don't know anything about it.
Well, that's exactly right. What he said was, yes, women in the church, their voices must be heard. Absolutely right. But female ordination is something very different, and that is not a conversation that will happen.
You are probably correct in your interpretation of what's going to happen. I myself don't have a great problem with female priests, but on the other hand, I think there are other ways of achieving the same end, and I think the church is advancing along that channel, just giving them more to do without making them priests. I don't mean make-work things. I don't mean that they do only mundane or menial things. I mean serious things. But now, as you know, virtually every parish is run by women anyway.
Well, motherhood, of course, is the most important vocation in the world. And we have simultaneously, with the rise of feminism, downplayed motherhood. I mean, we have campaigns to say we need a certain number of women MPs so they can go to Parliament and just behave like sheep when their party leaders tell them what to do. But at the same time, they will leave their children behind. I hope I don't sound like someone who's rooted in times past. I want women to stay at home.
Michael, you sound like a traditionalist.
Well, I am a traditionalist, but whilst women must be liberated and must be free and autonomous, the place of motherhood has been downplayed terribly in the past 40 to 50 years, and we've seen the result of that in family breakdown.
Let us move along to an area where I think our church is on slightly more difficult terrain. and that is this whole business of contraception. I think the church can hold the line on abortion, and while my own views are very marginally at variance with the church's, I think the rigor of their view that all life is sacred and therefore abortion is the destruction of life and is almost indistinguishable from murder is a position that can be upheld. Contraception is another matter. I think that I think there is a problem with it, if you'll pardon the adverb conceptually, but in addition to that, we get into a tactical argument. Now, I realize that mixing tactics and principles is hazardous and is usually a matrix for sophistry, cowardice, and ultimately the abandonment of all convictions and principles. I'm not starting down that slippery slope, but in taking the position the church does, it does make it very easy for its critics to represent it as precisely what I said earlier, a fraternity of septuagenarian celibate men completely out of touch with contemporary sex practices as facilitated by what we might broadly call scientific advances in contraception, and causing the church an unnecessary difficulty of credibility and adherence by seeking to inflict unnecessary inconvenience on sincere adherents. I mean, just sitting there waving an absolute injunction against contraception isn't, I think, theologically necessary, and it is not tactically wise. Now, if it was the second and not the first, I certainly wouldn't favor it, because I draw the line almost as preveniently, I think is the correct religious word, as you do, on not compromising principles in a thing like this. But I think there's room to vary this a bit.
Well, I write about this in the book because this is
I know you do.
This is an area where there will be debate. There won't be about abortion. Life begins at conception.
No, there won't. I don't think there will be in serious circles in that organization.
At the point of, it's a scientific argument. An unborn child at that point of conception has a totally distinct DNA and genomic character. The church,
and it fights for life.
Of course. The church's implementation of natural law, no. I mean, contraception, and I'm not a fool. I do understand that the vast majority of Catholics...
I was not accusing you of being a fool.
No, I know. The vast majority of Catholics, even who go to Mass, I would think, I don't know the numbers, but many of them would not observe teaching on contraception because it's incredibly challenging. Now, it's incredibly challenging to turn the other cheek and to love your neighbor as yourself and to love God with all your heart.
And we don't always turn the other cheek.
No, we fail miserably. We fail miserably.
But when we enjoy doing it frequently.
But when it comes to contraception, because of the visceral desire for that sexual relationship, and we're even assuming within marriage, people will say, well, does it really matter? Now, they haven't been well formed as Catholics, I would agree. They haven't had the teaching presented to them very well, I would agree. There were many priests in the 60s and 70s who even denied church teaching and wouldn't teach it. I would agree with all of that. But what does the church say? It says that when it comes to marriage, the procreative norm is essential. Marriage is a child-centered institution. We have to be open to procreation. God's plan is for children. That doesn't mean, and has never meant, that every sexual act must result in a child. Church teaching, it's not the rhythm.
If it did, we would have been built that way, and we weren't.
Yeah, and the rhythm method that people joke about is, before I was born, I think that was, I'm not going to go into details here, far too graphic, but what church teaching,
this is family entertainment.
It is family entertainment.
It's really... Avoid salacity.
It gives women complete control of the relationship, and it comes down to, there are certain times in the month when you probably will conceive, there are certain times when you will conceive, and there are certain times when you just cannot conceive. And so the church is saying you can control when you will have children, but it means controlling yourself at certain times. And a lot of people today say, I don't want to do that. I want to do this, have sex whenever I want it. It's up to me. The church is saying, when you aggressively exclude God and his plan, procreation, from the marriage bed, you're denying his love. When you say by the use of latex or chemicals, you cannot conceive, you're saying God has no place in this relationship. And I think that contraception has not prevented abortion, it's enabled a culture that sees the sexual act in itself as something to be revered, We do not live in a happy age in terms of sexuality. If somebody could show me that contraceptives, the pill and condom and the rest has made people incredibly happy, I would say, well, I still don't approve, but at least you have an argument. But it hasn't. It's debased us, it's devalued us, it's devalued sexual intimacy. Conrad, it's incredibly difficult. I mean, I'm of an age now, my wife and I, where none of this
we've
really
cooled
matters.
out a bit, Michael.
Well, yes, and things don't matter so much. But I mean, when I was in my 30s, I had a full head of hair, Conrad. I was pulling it out. My poor wife, she, thank goodness for church teaching. But it's very difficult. It's very difficult. It's not that it is wrong. It's very hard to follow. It's challenging, and that's why so many people try and find a way out of it.
I generally speaking agree with you, but I do not agree that recourse to contraception is dispensing with God. I understand why you say it, but I think it need not be the case, and one can't just say in the abstract that is the case. Secondly, I put it to you that more recent methods of contraception, prior acts of contraception, not after the fact, have substantially altered the nature of the act. And whereas, I'm rather older than you, but when I hit that golden window where it all started. But say my brother was only 4 years older than I was. When he started out socially and was at least physically eligible for this kind of activity, there was a tremendous risk, if it happened, that it could lead to an unplanned and inconvenient procreation, and that's changed. And I think that this. Well, I agree. We don't live in a particularly happy world. I agree with that. But I think the reduction of sexual tensions and frustrations has been a useful thing and a good thing. And the fact is, to a great many people, sex is just an enjoyable activity. It's like playing tennis or downing a few martinis, only more and better. Yeah. And it isn't quite the sacred act that it was when at any time other than, if impossible by the female calendar, it could lead to procreation. And I think it's not a bad idea to contemplate, since in practice, as you said, most people don't follow these rules anyway, even amongst practicing Catholics, to make the Church's position conform a little more closely with justified behavior, not with heretical behavior.
It is a lot more fun than tennis, even than doubles tennis, and you can extend that
I never liked
to whatever.
Tennis, so I wasn't conceding much.
The contraceptive pill, and I've always thought it strange that we call it a pill, because a pill is meant to make you better, not profoundly alter how a woman's body is meant to work. Has it solved problems? Well, it's putting a very intrusive chemical into a woman's body to liberate them.
Yeah, but so is drinking a bottle of whiskey or something,
Well, I think that's slightly different. The idea of an unwanted child, I'm fully conscious that people who didn't control their urges, a child could result. My family tree on my mother's side was traced, and the person the genealogist said to me in hushed tones, "I think you'll find that your uncle was born." And anyway, he obviously my grandparents
out of wedlock. Good heavens, Michael!
I know.
Consider your invitation to this house withdrawn.
I fully understand. They got married. You see, she was pregnant. They got married.
It is too late to apologize.
Today, that wouldn't happen, would it?
No, nor should it, by the way.
There
should be no discrimination against people in those cases.
No, but they had a wonderful marriage. They got married. They were married all of their lives. My grandfather went off to 4 years of war, and the Second World War came back, and it was a marvelous family. It wasn't extraordinary. It was wonderfully ordinary, actually, an ordinary working class family. But
good, solid people, backbone of the nation.
Good, solid people. I don't believe, if we look at young people at university, especially the way young women behave, we've liberated women through contraception by enabling them to act like 19-year-old boys. I'm not sure if that is a triumph. I think it's actually a tragedy.
I didn't say it was a triumph, but it is, as you've just said, a fact.
Yes.
And it is also a fact that responsible, successful people of both sexes who are unattached, consenting adults, in my opinion, can have sexual relations without compromising their religious lives. You can do it. And in fact, it does happen all the time.
It happens, whether it's desirable, of course it happens.
I didn't say it was desirable, but on the other hand, I think we look. Let us face facts. The church is giving a counsel of perfection. You, in your book, apostrophized the Winnipeg Convention, or whatever it was called, where they met in the Fort Garry Hotel in Winnipeg, and the bishop said, in effect, that the Pope has spoken, but those those of our co-religionists in this country who feel that their interests commend to them the use of contraceptive devices shouldn't feel this separates them from their church. So that's not a verbatim quote, but that was the essence of it.
Yeah.
And
that had no standing, though, in church teaching.
But I thought it was, in fact, a sensible position to take, and my late friend Cardinal Carter was one of those who was responsible for it, and he obviously thought that.
But he did reverse his position, or partially reverse his position, later on.
Only very slightly.
But why did they come to that position? Because they thought the teaching was wrong, or because they thought the teaching was difficult?
I am not qualified to impute motives to the bishops. I don't know, and with the utmost respect, I'd be careful about doing it unless you actually do know.
No, I don't know either, but I think that this is part of the problem here. It's not that we find it to be immoral, unethical, inappropriate. We find it to be incredibly difficult.
But you see, is it better, and I'm putting this neutrally, I don't know the answer, is it better for the church to give a counsel of perfection and say, this is the standard we should all aim at, we being a worldly and knowledgeable and experienced and legitimate church know that we don't always behave as we would wish we would, and there will be shortcomings, but this is what we should aim at, and shortcomings should be admitted and toiled to overcome. Or should we say, this is a standard of perfection, but as a practical matter, we're not going to meet that, and therefore we should, up to a point, not overly reproach ourselves for not meeting it, because it isn't altogether bad in some ways that we don't.
I don't think we do overly reproach. And interesting story, the Christendom, all of Christendom really, had the same view on teaching and contraception as the Roman Catholic Church does today, until 1930.
Well, the Anglicans packed up their cards in 1930, I believe.
Exactly.
It was a fiasco.
That's when the Anglican Synod decided to change their teaching on
Yeah, but they
contraception.
didn't have contraception like we have it now.
No,
I mean,
but
a condom is a horribly inconvenient business.
But the
Not that I ever
evangelical
used
churches pretty much followed. And if you look at the decline in many of those churches, but also, this is very interesting, I think, and it's quite compelling, the more thoughtful, sophisticated evangelical Protestants in the United States who are pro-life, who are fighting abortion, it's extraordinary how many of them come to the Catholic Church's position on contraception. I think of the PCA, Presbyterian Church in America, with some quite remarkable philosophers within it. They're beginning to come towards this way of...
Well, they're the authentic followers of Dr. Knox, aren't they?
They are certainly Calvinists, yes.
Well, then, apart from the papacy, they would actually be more conservative than the Roman Catholic Church.
They have a very interesting... I mean, I admire their view of Christianity and their teaching Christianity. I think their theology is wrong. I don't believe in predestination. But they are... Contraception is not a stand-alone issue. It's part of a seamless garment, if you like. It's what life is. What does sex lead to? What is it supposed to be about? No one would say it's only for procreation. That's the bizarre position. But nor is it only...
That's bizarre with an A or an I.
but nor is it only for enjoyment and fun. I would hope that it's enjoyable, great fun, but that the procreative probability, or certainly possibility, is never aggressively, deliberately expunged from that equation. That's when I think we have a trouble with God's place in our marriage. We're not going to agree on this, comrade.
I'm afraid not. And I just hate to give that much ammunition to our opponents for no reason. I mean,
they will attack us
if we were, but we can make it as difficult as we can make it for them
without compromising on truth.
conscientiously.
Yes.
Yeah. Well,
but they'll attack us on abortion. They'll attack us on the abuse crisis. They'll misinterpret things that Pope said.
They thought they'd won the match on the abuse crisis. The New York Times was virtually giving a free tour of Manhattan to anyone who could recollect, however mistily, a clergyman or a novice putting a hand on her kneecap in Patagonia in the 1920s. You know, I mean, anything to expose this vast structure of hypocrisy, which, as you point out, could not possibly have affected more than 2% of church personnel.
Well, and an earlier book, Why Catholics Are Right, there's a whole chapter on that. Just a couple of weeks ago, the New York Times said, after years of doing nothing, the Pope Francis has appointed a commission to look into the abuse of
rubbish.
Absolutely horrible thing to say. The church is probably the safest place for a young person to be. And whilst we must never downplay what happened, it was horrendous, it was grotesque, we have to be honest. And 2 to 3% of Roman Catholic clergy, and many of them indirectly involved. Most of these cases were from 20, 30, 40 years ago. The church reacted as most institutions did. They were told, move the offender, tell them off, and counsel them.
Yeah.
Well, they did, and that was ridiculous advice, but that was given to school superintendents and hockey coaches and everyone. That's what was told at the time. There were some people
Look,
covering.
the whole thing is being, and I like yourself, I'm absolutely not minimizing it. It's a terrible business.
Of course.
And it has to be torn out root and branch. But the fact is it's being used illegitimately as a club to assault the institution, with this business of the prosecutor in Los Angeles charging the former Archbishop Cardinal Mahoney with racketeering because of his handling of the whole issue of offending priests is an outrage. Some of these financial awards are an outrage. It's just a secular assault to try and bankrupt the church. Now, it won't work, but it's outrageous.
Conrad, a young friend of mine, very bright young woman, recently graduated from Oxford, was offered an extremely lucrative position with a law firm in London, and declined when she was told that part of their ambition was to bankrupt the church. They were suing not to defend young people who had been abused, but to use those young people who had been abused to try and bring down the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah, well, despite the unending efforts of the church's critics to portray it as a vastly rich, abusive organization, the fact is it is under assault. It has always been under assault, and it is rich in the sense that it was the conservator and promoter of Western culture, and it was responsible for the subsistence and the encouragement of virtually every great artist in the Renaissance, and many since that time. But it has its vulnerabilities, like all institutions, and it's always under assault, but it always survives.
Yeah, and the day the assault stops is a day that we've got it terribly wrong. We are countercultural.
With that said, if you don't mind me saying so, I think you're getting prematurely into a sort of martyrdom mode here, that the church will shrink as the inadequately faithful depart under pressure from peers telling them to get out and enjoy themselves in a liberated way and have done with all this superstitious nonsense, but it will be a leaner, better organization. And by the way, I don't see that that's what this Pope is saying. I think he's trying to cast a wider umbrella, but he's ready for anything.
We have to divide Christendom here, because in the West, in North America and Western Europe, look, in the Czech Republic, there's virtually no one left. There were so few people go to Mass. It's holding strong in certain areas. Ireland is divided, Spain is divided, Croatia is still very strong.
Poland's not too bad.
And Poland's not bad at all. But that's not where the growth will be. The growth will be in Africa and Asia. When China finally throws off communism, we're going to have about 150 to 200 million serious Orthodox Roman Catholics let loose on the world.
That is an ambitious number to what I've seen.
I think it's close to that. We're talking about more than 1 billion people. I mean, the number of Christians is vast. The number of those who are Catholic, the underground churches are huge.
Do we think there are more than 100 million people now?
I think the numbers of Christians...
And they're about half Catholic, aren't they?
Yes. Well, it's very hard to know, because there's the official church and there are the house
churches.
churches.
You mean this ghastly Catholic Patriotic Association, which is just a heresy. And one of the greatest moments, one of many, of Pope John Paul II was when he excommunicated all of them.
Well, they're not unlike the National Lutheran Church in Germany under Hitler. These are people who have collaborated with the regime and thus betrayed Christianity. They were Lutheran, in this case they're Catholic. But huge numbers throughout Asia. It's very interesting in India. If my wife's family, my mother-in-law at least.
Or you might have mentioned the Orthodox Church collaborating with Stalin too.
Well, some, not all. There were many Orthodox priests and bishops who didn't, but there were... and if you look at in Ukraine, actually, Eastern Rite Catholics.
Oh, the Uniates. They were hero group.
Yeah, they really were.
Hero sect.
But in India, I was mentioning
they have married clergy, by the way.
Of course. Married clergy entirely possible. The ordinariate, Anglican converts, are married too. My wife's family, my mother-in-law, Catholics from India. If you speak to Indians, an Indian Hindu will have seen and known an Indian Christian rather than an Indian Sikh. Christians are more common than Sikhs in India.
Yes,
many Catholics in India.
About 60 million or something.
Very large number. In Africa, and when they're fighting Islamic triumphalism, AIDS, injustice, poverty, I mean, these are the real things.
They're being murdered in large numbers.
And these are not the people who are obsessing about female ordination. These are the people who are
where are secular leaders complaining about that?
Pardon me?
Where are our secular leaders complaining about the persecution of Christians?
My next book, Conrad, has to be finished next year, is Islam's War on Christianity. The most persecuted group in the world today are Christians, Catholic and Protestant. And whilst it does happen in the non-Islamic world, it is overwhelmingly within Islam.
And it happens in communist countries too.
It does to a certain degree, but communism is moribund. It happens in some Hindu nationalist areas in India, but that's not typical of Hinduism.
Not too bad. No.
It's under Islam, and this is what has to be understood. It's getting worse and not better.
And even moderate Muslim countries like Indonesia,
Malaysia, Turkey, Morocco, and whatever Saddam Hussein was, whatever Assad is, as secular leaders, if anything, they protected. They didn't persecute Christians.
No.
They're being replaced in Iraq, and we'll see what happens in Syria, by people who do persecute Christians. In Egypt, the plight of the Coptic Christians is appalling.
And they're over 10% of the population?
Yeah, and it could well be, as with Jews in the former Soviet Union, it's much higher than that. There are a large number.
Although a lot of those Soviet Jews weren't really Jews, as you know. They were Jews for the purpose of immigration.
Well, it's interesting, because
I mean, not that I have anything against that.
No, but it's fascinating when you, I mean, I spend quite a bit of my time in the Middle East, and in Israel you'll meet Israeli soldiers from Russia who go back to meet their family, and there are icons on the wall and crucifixes, and yet it's a great mixture. But Christians are suffering terribly in the Islamic world. And just recently, someone...
And the Holy See is the only organization that says anything about it.
Doesn't do enough. I have to say, it's one of the areas where I am a little critical. It doesn't
but
do enough.
At least it speaks out. It may not do enough, but it does speak out.
The Pope recently, in the Gospel of Joy, he was rather, I have to say this with the greatest respect to the Holy Father, when he said that properly understood, the Quran presents a religion of peace. I think he's wrong.
Yeah, so do I. And I think you make that point very well here. Who was it who you said, was it the previous Pope who said the prophet Muhammad had the Koran descend upon him, and therefore there's no ability to interpret it like there is for Christians with the sacred scriptures.
If we are not allowed to critique the primary text of our religion, we do not live in a free world. And thank goodness people can mock the Bible. I hate it when they do, but they can. They must be allowed to. We cannot do that with the Quran. We have to ask.
But even dutiful Muslims, as I understand it, have to take it exactly as written.
Well, they do.
Whereas you can interpret the scriptures.
We have to ask some fundamental, if not fundamentalist, questions about Islam in terms of the West. Does Islam allow for gender equality? Will it allow the free conversion of its adherents to other religions? Will it respect and tolerate and treat as equals people who have a same-sex attraction? Now,
well, the answer, the third question, there are a few countries that would, but in general, the answer to all three is no.
Yeah. And so Islam living in the diaspora in the Western world and in the Islamic heartlands of North Africa and Pakistan. Look, contrast India with Pakistan. For all of India's problems, it is a pluralistic nation where Indian Muslims are treated with equality.
It is a democracy too.
Pakistan, blasphemy law, the way not only Christians but Sikhs, Muslim dissidents are treated, the way women are treated. And yet, and you know this better than I do.
God help any Jews if there were any in Pakistan.
Oh, do you know, there was a time when Jews in Pakistan were treated with enormous respect and reverence.
When the British ran it.
And even Jinnah's idea,
he was a civilized man.
He was British educated, but it was a place for Muslims to live in the area. It wasn't the Islamic State it has become. And if ever we ask these questions in an informed, respectful way about Islam, we're immediately closed down as being people who hate and are bigoted. Well, that's simply not true. But I want equal treatment of all religions and all ideologies. We must be able to speak and discuss without fear.
More. I'm in a raging debate now in the National Review with people not on the issue of how the United States must recognize the extent to which Islam is an enemy, but with what they consider to be the sources of its failure to do so. That's where our debate is, but not on the problem, but the source of the problem. Let me just move on for a moment to the question of gays or homosexuals. If I understand you correctly, you have no objection to such people making a union that has civil law consequences. You object to it being called a marriage.
Well, I don't speak for the church here.
No, but I'm asking you.
This is the most difficult question I face as a Catholic. I have no problem with the abortion issue, for example.
And you have no problem with gays personally.
Well, my issue here is because I have so many gay friends, people who have been so helpful to me in my life and who I love dearly. I thought that civil union, which is not really church teaching, but I thought that civil union was an extremely convincing way to satisfy the vast majority of gay and straight people. So it's not marriage, but it gives a legal definition and a certain splendor.
A relationship with consequences. Yes.
But it didn't work, because in the UK where it was tried, and I think it did satisfy most people, it was used not as an answer, but as a stepping stone. And of course,
as a what?
As a stepping stone.
I see.
And so as soon as it was achieved, within a few years, and now there's full marriage in the UK. And there are even gay activists who said, no, we everything we wanted, we've had. Why are we doing this? There was a Tory MP in Britain, an openly gay man, who said, this is wrong. We're alienating so many...
Duncan?
No, it was someone less known than that. I can't remember who it was. But there are gay people who don't believe in marriage, but there are many gay people who've said, I think civil union would be enough. But that argument is long gone. Now it is about marriage, and we are losing, and we will lose more often. Recently there was a referendum in Croatia, and the Croatian people said no to same-sex marriage. But what will happen is there'll be huge influence from the European community and the United States to change that policy, and let's see what happens. But I honestly believe that you can be completely free of hatred towards gay people and still believe that marriage is a union of one man and one woman. I don't think there's a contradiction there.
I agree that there is not. I think that it is going to be difficult in practice to replicate the equivalence of status that you have in what we might call conventional marriages and civil marriages, or those marriages, whether civil or religious. On the gay side, though, I mean, the state cannot, although there have been just tentative flickerings of an effort to do it, cannot force a religious denomination to marry two people of the same sex.
No, it can't, and I don't think it will. There are people who panic at this idea. They shouldn't. When I think of Canada and the UK, countries I know well in the United States, I don't think that will ever happen. What may happen is the argument could be made, if you don't support the teachings or the views of the state and the courts, then why are you getting charitable status? I've heard this put forward, you won't marry same-sex couples, you'll lose charitable status. Well, if churches do, they do. It's not the end of the world. It would be a great shame.
Then that would not fly in. You could do that in a few Western countries, but not many.
I don't think it will be accepted by the vast majority of people. I think even many gay people would say, no, that's too harsh. It's been proposed by some people. When there's a state church, in Scandinavia actually, with national Lutheran churches that are very liberal, some clergy...
It's paid by the government.
Yes, exactly. So that's been more problematic. But no, and if that would happen, people would simply leave that church and set up a different church. But in terms of the Roman Catholic Church, I don't believe anyone is trying to push that on the church. The church will not marry, cannot marry gay people. An
attempt to revoke the charitable status of the Roman Catholic Church, even in a place like France, would be a disaster.
I don't think
that certainly is not going to work in this country or the United States.
What has happened is not for churches, but those that are connected in some way to churches that are charities. They have been questioned if they don't employ gay people. It wasn't so much the marriage issue, but there have been a couple of cases where...
Well, but then you have to establish that that's the reason. These things are terribly unpleasant.
They are.
There shouldn't be cases like that. There's absolutely no reason in the world not to employ gay people.
They could be
discriminate against them in any way.
Well, Conrad, most of these could be solved with a great deal of Canadian common sense. So there was I can think of many cases, but there was one with a printer He was an evangelical fellow in Ontario. And he had clients who were gay. It wasn't an issue. It wasn't even his business. But he was then presented with material to print from the Gay and Lesbian Archive, and he found the contents of the material uncomfortable. So he said to the people involved, look, I'll give you another printer who will do this, but I don't want to do it. And they said, we want you to do it. And they took him to a Human Rights Commission. It went on for some years and cost him tens and tens of thousands of dollars. Mm-hmm. Now that's when I believe there is triumphalism on display.
Yeah, the Human Rights Commissions are a departure from Canadian common
well, they
sense.
are. They are. And this has happened, it happened to a Knights of Columbus Hall in British Columbia with a gay couple. But most of these cases could be settled if both sides would just act in a more mature manner. Mm-hmm. I don't think the gay community supports some of the activists who seem to be shopping for people to use as examples to take to court sort of human rights commissions. That is happening. It's happening in the UK quite a bit, and that's a little disturbing.
Yeah. Well, look, I'm afraid the UK has rather let the side down in some of these things.
Just recently, after the death of Nelson Mandela, nothing to do with the church, but a man made a joke. It wasn't even that bad. I think it was... My computer takes so long to shut down, I'm thinking of calling it Nelson Mandela. Now, it wasn't that funny, but it wasn't particularly tasteless, actually.
Not too bad.
He was arrested. He was held for 8 hours and interrogated. He was fingerprinted, DNA tested. His
on the grounds that he was inciting racial...
I'm not even sure, because
hostility.
now to offend in Britain, of course, is against the law. If I am offended by... Now, these cases are not common, but
disrespected, as the African Americans say.
Oh, wonderful! So
he disrespected me.
You dissed me, so you're under arrest. I mean, it's wonderfully British. There's a video of a Pentecostal preacher being arrested in Wimbledon, of all places, and the cops who arrest him say, "I'm so sorry, but I have to arrest you now," and they take him off. And he was let go the following day, but whilst he was in prison, he wanted...
like Stalin saying to Bukharin, I like you personally, but I'm afraid I'm going to execute you.
Well, in this case, he was in the cell, and he said, could I have a Bible? And they said, oh, of course. And they came back and said, I'm afraid we haven't got any left. So the next day, he came along with a box of Gideon Bibles. Oh, thank you very much, sir. Not a problem. I mean, but it was still wrong. He was arrested, and at one point, a police officer said to him, if a gay person came to you and said they were hungry, would you feed them? Now, this is bizarre. This is ridiculous.
No, it's like a Monty Python.
It really is. So that we must make sure at all levels the state withdraws from personal activity and personal opinions.
But it only withdraws the way an acquisitive beast withdraws. If you slam its paws or
I think you're probably right.
Smash a steak against its teeth or something. Yeah. It has to scorch itself politically. You see, I think, and you may think I'm mad, I hope you don't, but I think that even in Europe there actually will be some kind of a partial religious revival because the secularists have made such a colossal mess of things.
Where else would we go? I quote scripture. I think that could well be true. Look, when communism, there were very few people in the communist empire who enjoyed being ruled by communism. Mm-hmm. But it took the Catholic Church in Poland to crystallize that opposition and actually bring or initiate the collapse of communism. Mm-hmm. Now, the Europe that I know, yes, I think there has been rather a renaissance in religiosity. Then I'm not going to pretend the numbers are vast, but the quality and the intensity is admirable.
And the quality of theological writing in Germany and in France is very high. Now, it always has been. And now, it may be read by, it's maybe the sort of church you're talking about, where it's read by a relatively small number of people, but it's absolutely brilliantly formulated.
It is. And New Alliances, too, what we saw in France when same-sex marriage was being discussed, was a union of the small but quite active French Protestant church, the Huguenots, French Jewry, and the Roman Catholic Church. Now, you know French history so terribly well. There was a time when an alliance between the Catholic Church in France and French Jews wouldn't have happened. It has now.
And even the Protestants, the state within a state, as Richard called them. Well, a cardinal of whom it was said by the Pope at the time when he died, when Richelieu died, if there is a God, this is the Pope speaking, he will have a lot to answer for. If there isn't, he was a great statesman. The Archbishop of Paris, Vantois, won that battle over gay marriages, didn't they?
Well, yes, but there was a change of government, and it's fascinating because if you look at
And
the French,
Paris has a gay mayor.
yeah, if you look at the parliamentary report from about 10 years before that was not religious in foundation. It was a brilliantly argued a case why marriage was a child-centered institution, and it was really nothing to do with the same-sex issue. It was really what marriage was supposed to be. And of course,
The French are wonderful at that. You know, I took my law degree in Quebec, and we read a lot of cases from France.
Yeah.
And they, often the most startling verdicts came from masterly arguments that had practically nothing to do with the facts, but they seemed to, and then moved away from them.
And the Archbishop of Paris, of course, before the current one, was a man who was a
Jewish
Jew,
Lustiger,
whose family died in the death camps.
Yeah.
And
it wasn't he born in a death camp?
I'm not sure if he was. I know he was raised by a Catholic family. And when Pope John Paul said to him, I think he phoned him and said, "I'm going to make you the Archbishop. You're going to be the cardinal here." He said, "Are you sure you want to do this? This is France." But he was wonderful.
Yes, yes. Michael, thank you so much. Very
Great
interesting always to speak with you.
Thank you so much.